Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In this episode, I want to provide you with an update on the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, if you've been following the channel over the last year or so, you'll know that the explosions that took place in September on the Nord Stream pipelines were one of the turning points in terms of the relations between Russia and Europe. Up until that point, Russia was still selling large volumes of natural gas to Europe, and a large portion of this was being supplied directly by the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to Germany. And these pipelines are major infrastructure projects. The first one was built over 10 years ago and runs under the Baltic Sea, and it was so successful that Russia decided to build a second parallel pipeline to double the amount of gas that it could sell to Germany on a daily basis. And even though Germany had come out and applied sanctions against Russia after the invasion started in February, it was still buying all of that gas because it needed it to produce electricity and also to feed that gas to its consumers and industry. So reluctantly, Germany continued with the economic relationship because it was very difficult to be able to put replacement supplies in place. But as soon as those explosions took place, that cut the physical supply of that gas to Germany and meant that Germany had to ramp up all of its LNG facilities. So that was really a turning point economically in terms of the sale of gas from Russia to Europe. Now, after those explosions took place, there was an investigation. Both the Danish and the Swedish authorities sent their divers down and did a full report on what had happened, and they both concluded that the damage was caused by deliberate explosions. But we've never really got to the bottom of who was behind those explosions. There's a lot of speculation that Russia actually sabotaged the pipelines themselves, but there's also been a variety of other accusations that it could have been countries from the West. And an American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist has now published a report in which he states that the USA were behind these attacks. So in today's video, I'll have a quick recap on the Nord Stream pipelines and the explosions that took place at the end of 2022. I'll then share with you the details of this report that's been published, and we'll have a look at who this journalist is, whether or not he's credible. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to whether or not I think the USA is behind these bombings. So before we get into all of that, if I could ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video, if you're enjoying the content, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I always include chapters, so if you don't have time to watch everything, you can skip through things. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube super thanks and membership, as well as buy me a coffee and Patreon. And as always, thank you so much to everyone that has supported the channel. I genuinely appreciate it. The Nord Stream 1 pipeline stretches for 745 miles under the Baltic Sea from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to northeastern Germany. It was constructed at a cost of $11 billion as a joint venture between Russia and Germany and opened in 2011. It can send a maximum of 170 million cubic meters of gas per day from Russia to Germany. Since it opened, the pipeline has been so successful and demand for gas has risen so much that a second pipeline, Nord Stream 2, was constructed alongside the pipeline. You can see on this graphic that it runs in exactly the same course. Nord Stream 2 was completed in November 2021. However, it has never opened and never become operational due to the fact that the USA was opposed to doubling down on the provision of gas from Russia to Germany on the basis that it would give Russia too much political leverage over the supply of gas to Europe. This graphic shows the amount of gas that's been transmitted through Nord Stream 1 every year since 2013. And you can see for the last 4 years, it's been operating at close to maximum capacity and providing around 59 billion cubic meters directly to Germany. On the evening of Monday the 26th of September, Denmark issued a warning about a leak in the yet-to-be-opened Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which had been discovered by a Danish Defence F-16 fighter jet. Methane gas could be seen rising to the surface of the water in an area over 100 metres wide, and the Danish authorities declared a 5-mile exclusion zone as the area was dangerous to shipping. In response to this, Nord Stream 2's operator stated that the pressure in the pipeline had dropped from 105 bars to 7 bars. Following on from the reports of the leak in Nord Stream 2, 2 further leaks were reported for Nord Stream 1 on Tuesday the 27th of September. The 2 pipes were damaged near the Danish island of Bornholm in the southern Baltic Sea. Sweden's National Seismology Centre said its stations recorded powerful subsea blasts in the area where the gas leaks occurred. the latter measuring the equivalent of a magnitude 2.3 earthquake. A senior seismologist stated that there was no doubt that these were explosions, and that the latter and the stronger of the two blasts was equivalent to 100 kilograms of dynamite. He went on to state, "We know very well what an underwater blast looks like, and there is no doubt that this is not an earthquake." On the 8th of February, Seymour Hersh published an article entitled "How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline." In the article, he stated that in June 2022, US Navy divers, operating under the cover of a widely publicised midsummer NATO exercise known as Balltops 22, planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines. And this information has come from a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. The article went on to say 2 of the pipelines, which are known collectively as Nord Stream 1, had been providing Germany and much of Western Europe with cheap Russian natural gas for more than a decade. A second pair of pipelines called Nord Stream 2 had been built but were not yet operational. Now, with Russian troops missing on the Ukrainian border and the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945 looming, President Joseph Biden saw the pipelines as a vehicle for Vladimir Putin to weaponize natural gas for his political and territorial ambitions. Biden's decision to sabotage the pipelines came after 9 months of highly secret back-and-forth debate inside Washington's national security community about how best to achieve that goal. For much of this time, the issue was not whether to do the mission, but how to get it done, with no overt clue as to who was responsible. There was a vital bureaucratic reason for relying on the graduates of the Center's hardcore diving school in Panama City. The divers were Navy only and not members of America's Special Operations Command, whose covert operations must be reported to Congress and briefed in advance to the Senate and the House leadership, the so-called Gang of Eight. The Biden administration was doing everything possible to avoid leaks as the planning took place in late 2021 and into the first months of 2022. From its earliest days, Nord Stream 1 was seen by Washington and its anti-Russian NATO partners as a threat to Western dominance. The holding company behind it, Nord Stream AG, was incorporated in Switzerland in 2005 in partnership with Gazprom, a publicly traded Russian company producing enormous profits for shareholders, which is dominated by oligarchs known to be in the thrall of Putin. Gazprom controlled 51% of the company, with 4 European energy firms, 1 in France, 1 in the Netherlands and 2 in Germany, sharing the remaining 49% of stock, and having the rights to control downstream sales of the inexpensive natural gas to local distributors in Germany and Western Europe. Gazprom's profits were shared with the Russian government, and state gas and oil revenues were estimated in some years to amount to as much as 45% of Russia's annual budget. Nord Stream 1 was dangerous enough in the view of NATO and Washington, but Nord Stream 2, whose construction was completed in September 2021, would, if approved by German regulators, double the amount of cheap gas that would be available to Germany and Western Europe. The second pipeline would also provide enough gas for more than 50% of Germany's annual consumption. Tensions were constantly escalating between Russia and NATO, backed by the aggressive foreign policy of the Biden administration. A hand-picked team of Central Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency operatives were assembled somewhere in the Washington area under deep cover and worked out a plan using Navy divers, modified submarines, and a deep submarine rescue vehicle that succeeded after much trial and error in locating the Russian cable. The divers planted a sophisticated listening device on the cable that successfully interpreted the Russian traffic and recorded it on a taping system. That underwater success, codenamed Ivy Bells, was innovative and risky and produced invaluable intelligence about the Russian Navy's intentions and planning. Throughout all of this scheming, it's claimed that some guys working in the CIA and the State Department were saying, "Don't do this, it's stupid, it will be a political nightmare if it comes out." Nevertheless, in early 2022, the CIA reported, "We have a way of blowing up the pipelines." Sometime in March, a few members of the team flew to Norway to meet with the Norwegian Secret Service and Navy. One of the key questions was where exactly in the Baltic Sea was the best place to plant the explosives. Nord Stream 1 and 2, each with its 2 sets of pipelines, were separated much of the way by little more than a mile. The Norwegian Navy was quick to find the right spot in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea, a few miles off Denmark's Bornholm Island. The pipelines ran more than a mile apart along a seafloor that was only 260 feet deep. That would be well within the range of the divers, who, operating from a Norwegian Alta-class mine hunter, would dive with a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen and helium streaming from their tanks and plant shaped C4 charges on the 4 pipelines with concrete protective covers. It would be tedious, time-consuming and dangerous work, but the waters off Bornholm had the advantage that there were no major tidal currents, which would have made the task of diving much more difficult. Would be triggered remotely by a device dropped from a plane on short notice, but the procedure involved the most advanced signal processing technology. On September 26, 2022, a Norwegian Navy P-8 surveillance plane made a seemingly routine flight and dropped the sonar buoy. The signal spread underwater initially to the Nord Stream 2 and then onto Nord Stream 1. A few hours later, the high-powered C4 explosives were triggered and 3 of the 4 pipelines were put out of commission. Within a few minutes, pools of methane gas that remained in the shuttered pipelines could be seen spreading on the water's surface, and the world learned that something irreversible had taken place. So who is Seymour Hersh, and does he carry any credibility whatsoever? Well, Seymour Hersh is a veteran investigative journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a massacre that took place during the Vietnam War. He started his career as a police reporter for the City News Bureau in Chicago in 1959, and then worked for publications like the United Press International in South Dakota and the news agency The Associated Press. In 1968, he took a break from journalism to serve as the press secretary for the campaign for the Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy, but soon after returned to reporting and went to the Vietnam War as a freelance journalist. He later went on to work for the New York Times and has also contributed to the New Yorker. In 1970, Hersh won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for exposing the My Lai massacre and its cover-up during the Vietnam War. The investigative report, published on the 12th of November 1969, claimed that the US Army had murdered thousands of unarmed Vietnamese citizens. Hersh later joined the New York Times and covered the Watergate scandal, which involved the administration of then US President Richard Nixon. And a decade later, he wrote one of the most talked about books of the time, The Price of Power: Kissinger in the Nixon White House. Most recently, in 2015, he alleged that the Obama administration had lied about the 2011 raids in Pakistan, in which al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden was killed. According to him, Pakistan had kept the terrorist in prison since 2006, and they knew about the raid. The US, of course, rubbished this claim. So whilst undoubtedly Hersh has done credible work and won many awards, including 2 National Magazine Awards for public interest, his recent articles have been criticised for making implausible claims, often citing anonymous sources. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines is an unanswered question. We're all fascinated to know who was behind those explosions. The investigations that took place by the Swedish and the Danish authorities have concluded that they were definitely explosions. So this was a deliberate act of sabotage. It wasn't just an explosion from the gas within the pipe. This was done deliberately. So the big question is, who is behind it? Well, when you look at all of the different parties involved, we know for sure that Germany was not behind this because Germany was still buying all of that gas from Russia. It needed that gas to produce electricity and to feed it to its industry and to its consumers. So reluctantly, Germany was still handing over large amounts of cash to Russia. So they definitely were not behind this. So really, the only other options are either somebody from the West, so it could have been the USA or the UK have been accused as well, or Russia themselves. So let's talk about the Russian option first. Did Russia sabotage their own pipeline? Well, there have been a lot of accusations made against Russia. And in terms of being able to pull together a plan that was undetectable, Russia had the best options because they would have been able to fit explosive devices to the pigs that move inside the pipes. They then could have sent those pigs down to the appropriate place and then detonated those explosions. So Russia was definitely best placed to pull this off without leaving any evidence. But the story that we've heard today from Seymour Hersh is that the Americans planted these devices months before the explosions took place. And that means that there would have been no trace at or around the time when they actually were detonated. Because that's been the biggest puzzle around this whole thing, is that there was no footage of any ships or planes or divers on the days before the explosion. But if, as Seymour Hersh is claiming, these explosives were put there months before, then obviously that is more difficult to detect because nobody's really following these satellite images on those long-term basis. Now, clearly now these accusations have been made, I'm sure somebody will be able to go out and have a look and see whether or not there's been any activity in the months before. But I guess there's always activity in these sort of waters. So it'll be very difficult to actually determine whether or not this story stacks up based on the satellite footage. So really this looks like a conspiracy theory, and unless somebody comes out and claims responsibility, we'll never know who's behind it. But in terms of whether or not there'd be any advantage from the USA's point of view to blowing up this pipeline, I think from an economic point of view, these explosions definitely caused a problem for Russia. They were still selling gas to Germany, they were still sending large amounts of gas. The amount had reduced to around 40% of the maximum capacity, but they were still earning tens of millions of euros out of those sales. So in terms of who would lose the most out of this, well, obviously Germany was affected because it had to buy more expensive LNG and other gas in the market. But overall, I think the biggest impact was on Russia. So in terms of the motive, Russia definitely had the most to lose from these explosions because firstly, they lost that income, and secondly, they lost the ability to be able to restart those supplies at any time in the future. Now that these pipelines have been damaged, it will cost a lot of money and take a lot of time and effort to be able to repair them. So taking out this supply chain on a permanent basis probably doesn't make that much logical sense from Russia's perspective, and potentially could have been something that the USA was interested in, because let's not forget, Joe Biden had been fiercely against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He'd been challenging that, saying that it gave Russia a lot of leverage over Europe, and that's why it never opened, because there was challenges in the courts and it wasn't approved. So theoretically, I think the USA could have been behind these attacks. The story that Seymour Hersh has come up with is believable, there is some logic behind that. So potentially the USA could have done this, but unfortunately there is no evidence. It's still a conspiracy theory. So I'll have to leave you to make up your own decision on this one. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up, and thanks for watching this video all the way through to the end.